This video is going to be about numbers and math in Generator. Let's start with the number control. So there are a few ways that you can change this value. You can type it in. Another way is you can use the up and down keys like in Figma. You can click and drag left and right, and you can click anywhere in this field. And my favorite happens to be using the mouse wheel. I find that this is the best compromise of speed and accuracy when changing values, but everybody's got their preferences, so you got options. In this control, you can see that it's basically unlimited. You can set whatever you want. In some controls, you don't have this option. So for example, interpolate. Anywhere you have a percentage, you're going to be limited to 0 and 100. But in certain cases, you might want to go outside of this range. Also notice that when you have a set range, there's a visual indication of where you are in that range, so you can even see it from far away. You don't need to look at the number. But sometimes you might want to extrapolate, for example, in this case. So what you do in that case is when you're changing the value, you can hold down Shift, and you get these 3 dots on both sides. Sometimes you get it only on one side. So what happens then is you can actually drag the value out, and you get this red indication that there's a value that's outside the range. If you drag it outside the other end, then the indication starts to stick out the other side. In general, the indication is as big as the range. So like if you're more than 100 out, the whole red bar will be filled. But by that point, I figure, you're already so far out that it doesn't really matter where the bar is. And it's most useful where you're just a little bit sticking out. Another type of number node is, or number control, is a select control. So an example of this is round. The round node lets you round values. That's pretty obvious. But actually, let me do like 1.234. And then on the outside, we're going to have a value. Now, this control works as a set of options. There's floor, there's round, and there's ceiling. Actually, this is just a number control. So if you click on it, there's the number that you can type in. So if you type in 0, you get floor. And if you right-click, then you get a list that you can choose from. And in the list, you see the index and the names of the options that you have. What this means is that you can have outside inputs. So like if you have 0 coming into ceiling or coming into the type, you get floor, and then you can change it here. If you go outside the allowed range, it gets clipped. Another example of this is in the color node. Over here you have this large swatch, but actually if you notice there are 2 sets of inputs and outputs. That's because the header technically ends here, and this is just a select control. So if you click it, you can choose another color space, and if you right click, then you have all of these here. Again, that means that you can plug in an external input and control it this way. Now let's talk about precision. So far we're looking at whole numbers. But if you want to have decimal places, that you just type them in and they get saved into the value. And in fact, the number of decimal places gets passed from node to node. Where this comes into play is, let's say you want to add 2 numbers or do any kind of math or whatever. And let's say that this one is a whole number and this one is a fractional number. When you do your operation, and you look at the result will most of the time have the largest number of decimal places of all the inputs. So if you have a third input with, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 decimal places, then the result will have 6 decimal places in the end. Precision in a system like this is tricky. One option is to just always show the full precision, but that is ugly. And in a lot of cases, you actually want like every isolated chunk of your graph to look as clean as possible. Otherwise, you're looking at too many numbers, too much visual contrast, and it's hard to read. But sometimes you do want all the decimal places. So for now, I don't know if this is going to be like this in the future, but for now, this is the best way that I found of being able to control it. You choose how many decimal places you want to see. In fact, the full precision is always in the value. And the value gets passed with the number of decimal places to show. So if you're doing things like division or interpolation, the calculation is correct and precise. You just might not want to see the full result. So like, let's do an example. So we'll have 5 divided by 7. I'm going to get the math node. I'll explain the difference between those in a minute. And let's say we're going to divide them. Here you have the same thing. You can choose your operation. And we're going to look at the result. So right now, the result is 1. Actually, the full result is point whatever. But because you're specifying whole numbers here, you're getting a whole number display here. If you were to plug this in and use this in some kind of geometric arrangement, you would get the correct value. You wouldn't get gaps or anything like that. If you want to see the full value or more precision, then you just type in more precision. So if you divide 5.00 by 7, you get 0.71. And again, this isn't the ideal solution, but it's a good compromise between everything I've had to squeeze into this system. So now I'm going to explain the difference between the simple and the complex. It's not, I don't have a good name for it. There's the simple math node and the multi-entry math node. I'm just, as a shortcut, I'm calling it complex math node. It looks simpler though. An analog to this is the MinMax node. There's the simple MinMax node, and then there's the complex MinMath node, which is over here in the functions. Whoops. See, this is what I'm talking about. The window's really small, so the menu doesn't fit, which is why I ended up doing all these weird things with the menu items. So let's start with a value. Let's say we have a value of 5, and we want to multiply it by 2. Well, one option would be to let me just bring it over here. So I got my 5, then I get my 2, then I get a standard type of math node. I plug both of them in, and I get my result. 5 plus 2 is 7. But this has this extra node, and very often you'll have to do things like multiply by 2, divide by 2, or like 1 over something. You don't want to have an extra node just for like a constant. So my solution to this was a simple math node. You start with the number 5, and then you just plug it into this node, and the operand is right here. So you just say 2, and whoops, that's not what I was trying to do. And here's your result. 5 plus 2 is 7. Another thing you might want to do is 1 over something. This is a common operation. Well, what you do is you select over, you put 1 here, and then you enable invert. So it's a little bit weird, but it keeps your graph cleaner, especially when you have to do this a lot. So 1 over 5 is 0.2, right? You got to do the invert thing. If you want to add or multiply or whatever a bunch of numbers like this, let's say you have 7, you got this one, and like a negative number. Then you use the multi-math node or the complex math node, whatever you want to call it. So you just plug them all in. But at this point, you really are plugging in a bunch of values and you want to see all the wires and stuff, so this makes sense. And then you can see the result. You can divide them, and the way this works is this is divided by this, and then divided by this, and then divided by this. Same with the modulus, but multiplication makes sense. So there you go, that's the final result. And again, if you enter some precision, it'll take the largest number of decimal places. So if you like, in terms of division, if you increase the number of decimal places, you're actually going to get a value because, you're not going down to 0, you're actually dividing a real value by something. Same thing with the min-max node. So let's say you have some value coming in and you want to make sure that it's not below 0, right? So what you could do is you could say this, and then we get 0, and then we connect them, and then we set it to max. And then, of course, in this case, we're going to get 65, but as we bring it down, it gets clipped to 0. But again, there's this extra constant, which is really not necessary. So instead, all right, I fixed the bug. We're just going to pretend that didn't happen. So instead of doing that, where you have a 0 and you're doing it through this, what we can do is we can say, we can use a simple min-max node. And then by connecting it like this and setting this to max, we get the same result, but the graph is cleaner. And when you multiply this by a lot of nodes, it gets a lot cleaner. So another thing that you will find are utility nodes. For this, I'm going to load one of the tutorials from the sets. I'll talk about sets in a different video, but this is just useful for explaining something. All right, so we have a set which creates a bunch of values. And let's say I want to have these values curved, right? So the way you would typically curve a value applied like a power curve or something is you have to subtract the minimum, divide by the difference between the minimum, the maximum and the minimum, do the power function, and then multiply by the difference and then add the minimum again, which is a whole bunch of nodes. Instead, what we can do is we can just plug in, let me just delete these comments, we can just plug in a curve. And what the curve allows you to do is it allows you to say, okay, so between 0 and 100, I want to apply a power curve. And that's what it does. So actually, in this case, it seems to be going outside of 100, so we can, of course, limit that. We can say limits, and it's between 0 and 100, so there you go. And then we control the power curve just between those values. If we want to make it a little bit more visible, we can say that we want to do it between like 0 and 300, and then plug this into here. There you go. And so now we're applying a power curve to a value without doing like a whole bunch of, node stuff. It's very, very clean. So it's a utility node, but it's very useful, and there's a number of utility nodes in Generator that help you clean up your graph. So another thing to talk about with regard to numbers are Booleans and conditionals. If we use a number node, we can put anything in there that we want. Booleans and conditionals work with zeros and ones. So once again, if you go, well, this is actually a type of operation, so you're going to get a different thing here. But if you plug this in, let's say we have a 0 and a 1. And by the way, this is something I didn't mention in the basics videos. Tab works across vertically aligned nodes. So if you can jump between these. So these are just Booleans, right? A 0 and a 1 gives a 0, a 1 and a 1 give a 1, a 0 or a 1 give a 1, and so on. You have exclusive or, bitwise not, and stuff like that. So with conditionals, the story is a little bit different because there's only a simple conditional node, because we don't really work with comparing more than one thing. So let's say we have this value, and I want to see if it's greater than 0. So then I plug it in, and my result is going to be a 0 or a 1, depending on whether this, well, here I'm going to choose greater, and then this is greater than 0, and so it's a 1. But if I now bring it down, it becomes a 0. A more visual or a more concrete example is we have two words, John and let's say Mary. And we want to use an if-else node to pick one. So there are a couple of things to note straight away. First of all, the condition here is marked by a check mark. If you set it to 0, it's marked by an X. And again, if you click on it, you get a 1 or a 0. There are two versions of this, and you'll see this in, for instance, the move node, right? Here you'll have a move space condition and a show center condition. One is colored, one is black and white. The reason I did this is that the colored ones are the ones I deemed more important than the others. And by that I mean you need to see them at a glance and from far away. And the others are sort of secondary, and so you might not need to see them all the time. So the secondary ones I make black and white, and the primary ones, or the more important ones, I make colored. And I think there's like only one important check per node at most. If you don't like this, or if you're in a mental space at a certain moment that you want to see the numbers instead of the visual representation, you can go over here in preferences and turn off show Boolean values as checks and crosses. And there you go. So you have 1, 0, 1, whatever. All right, so I happen to like them. And so now you can see that you can choose between John and Mary, If the condition is true, you get John. If the condition is false, you get Mary. Once again, this is a number, so you can have an outside input. So if you plug this in, 0 gives you John, or Mary rather, because it's false, and 1 gives you John because it's true. That's basically it for numbers. I mean, it's basic math. The functions that you will find in this menu all follow JavaScript conventions, except for things like round, where floor, round, and ceiling are in the same node. Because I figured they're all rounding the value, they're just doing it differently so they can all live in the same node. There's one last type of number that I want to talk about, and that's an index. So in generators, so far at least, there are 3 types of indices that you might be using. And this is relevant for pro subscribers. It's over here in the text menu under index to name. So again, this follows JavaScript standards. So you can have an index which gives you a day of the week. So if I get a text node over here, you'll have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on. You can have the month. In JavaScript, days of the week start with 1 instead of 0. And months, obviously, they start with 1. The last type of index, and this is quite a specific thing, is font name. So let me make this a little bit larger. This is not the final version of this, I think, but this is how it is for now. Over here in the text shape node, you can choose the font, and you can do this with the basic. I mean, this is a number. You can do this. It's a select control. And by the way, in select controls, you also have a little bar that indicates where in the range the value is, but it's thinner. It just seemed like it made no sense to make it like a number control, but it's there. So if you right click on this, you get a list of all the fonts that you can choose, right? With their indices as all select controls. When visualizing fonts, you might want to actually display your font name in the canvas, and this is what this is for. So these indices are these indices. And that's about it. So the next video is going to be about lists.